Welcome to Spiritual Story Time. This evening we'll be finishing our book, Stories of God by Rilke, and it will also be the end of our evening story time for a while. Perhaps we'll begin again if I find a book that really needs to be read out loud instead of silently. And so this evening I'd like to continue our wonderful stories of God. I hope you had a lovely day. We're doing all really fine here at Lotus Lake, and we are enjoying life and enjoying our meditation practices with our small community here. Rilke. This story is called A Society Sprung of an Urgent Need. I had just learned that our town also possesses a kind of artists' club. It recently came into being to meet a need that was, as one might easily imagine, very urgent, and rumor goes that it flourishes, quote unquote. When societies are at a loss what to do with themselves, they flourish. They have heard that one must do this in order to be a proper society. Needless to say, Herr Baum is honorary member, founder, flag father, and everything else in one and the same person, and has some difficulty in keeping these various dignities apart. He sent me a young man with an invitation to attend the club's evenings, quote unquote. I thanked him most politely, as goes without saying, but added that my entire activity during some 5 years past had consisted in doing the very opposite. Picture to yourself, I explained with appropriate seriousness, since that time hardly a moment has passed during which I have not been resigning, stepping out of some association or another, and yet there are still societies which, so to speak, contain me. The young man looked startled at first, and then, with an expression of respectful piety at my feet, he must have seen them in confirmation of my steppings out, for he nodded his head understandingly. That pleased me well, and as I had to leave at that moment, I suggested that he accompany me a little way. So we walked through the town and on beyond, through the station, for I had business in the neighborhood. We talked about a variety of things. I learned that the young man was a musician. He told me so, modestly. One would never have guessed it. Aside from the profusion of his hair, he was marked by a great, almost boundless readiness to help. During our not particularly long walk, he twice picked up one of my gloves, held my umbrella for me while I looked for something in my pockets, blushingly drew my attention to the fact that there was something sticking to my beard and a smut on my nose. His thin fingers lengthened the while as though they longed to approach my face helpfully in this way. In his zeal, the young man even dropped back from time to time and removed from the bushes with evident enjoyment dead leaves that in fluttering down had caught among the twigs. I foresaw that through these repeated delays I should miss my train. We were still some way from the station, and I decided to tell my companion a story to hold him a while at my side. I began without further preliminaries. I know how things went with one of those societies, one for which there was a real necessity. You shall see. Not so very long ago, 3 artists met by chance in an old town. The 3 artists naturally did not talk about art. At least, so it appeared. They spent the evening in the back room of an ancient inn, exchanging tales of their travel adventures and experiences of all sorts. Their stories became shorter and shorter, and more literal as time went on. and finally they had got down to a couple of jokes which they kept on bandying back and forth. To forestall any misunderstandings, I must also say at once that they were real artists, intended to be so by nature, as it were, and not by chance. This evening squandered in the back room of an inn cannot alter the fact, and we shall presently see what came of it. Other people, Philistines, came to this inn. The artists were discomfited and left. The moment they passed out of the door, they were changed men. They walked in the middle of the street, a little separated from each other. Their countenances still showed traces of their recent laughter, that strange disorder of the features. But the eyes of all three were already serious and observant. Suddenly, the one in the middle nudged the one on the right, who understood at once. Before them lay an alley, narrow, full of tremulous, warm twilight. It mounted slightly, which gave a very telltale perspective, and there was something uncommonly secretive about it, and yet again intimate. The three artists gave themselves up to the impression for a moment. They did not speak, for they knew one cannot say that sort of thing. They had, after all, become artists because there is much one cannot say. Suddenly the moon rose somewhere, picking out a single gable in silver, and a song floated up from a courtyard. Striving for effect, growled the artist in the middle, and they went on. They were walking a little closer together now, though they still took up the whole width of the street. So they came unexpectedly upon a square. This time it was the artist on the right who drew the attention of the others. In this broader, more open scene, there was nothing disturbing about the moonlight. On the contrary, it was a downright necessity that it should be there. It made the square look larger, gave the houses a surprising, expectantly listening life, and the flat, illuminated expanse of the pavement was audaciously broken in the middle by a fountain and its heavy cast shadow, a boldness which exceptionally impressed the artist. They stood close together, sucking, as it were, at the breasts of this mood. But they were unpleasantly interrupted. Light, hastening footsteps drew near. Out of the darkness of the fountain, a man's form materialized, welcomed the footsteps and what else belonged to them with the customary tenderness, and the beautiful square had suddenly become a wretched magazine illustration from which the three painters turned as one painter. "That damn novelistic element again," shouted the one on the right, denoting by this correctly technical term the lovers at the fountain. United in their resentment, the three wandered aimlessly round the town for a long time, continually discovering subjects, but each time enraged afresh by the way in which some banal incident or other ruined the quiet and simplicity of every picture. About midnight, they were sitting together at the inn, in the bedroom of the leftermost, the youngest, and had no thought of going to bed. Their nocturnal stroll had roused many plans and projects in their minds, and having shown them at the same time that they were at the bottom one in spirit, they were now intensely interested in exchanging points of view. They cannot be said to have expressed themselves in faultless sentences. They cast about them with a few words no uninitiated person would have grasped, but they understood each other so well by this means that nobody in the adjoining rooms could get to sleep until toward 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, this long confabulation had a visible result. Something in the nature of a society was founded, That is, it really had already existed the moment the aims and intentions of the three artists had proved so similar that one could only with difficulty separate them from each other. The final resolution of the society was promptly carried out. They traveled for 3 hours into the country and together rented a farm. Staying in town would have had no point at this juncture. Out there, they intended first to acquire their style, that particular personal certainty, the eye, the hand, or whatever one calls all those things without which a painter may indeed live, but cannot paint. In the acquisition of all these virtues, cooperation, the society itself was to help, and particularly the honorary member of this society, nature. By nature, artists understand everything that God had made himself, or might, under certain circumstances, have made. A fence, a house, a fountain. All these things are usually of human origin. But when they had been standing in the landscape for a time, so that they had taken on certain qualities from the trees and bushes and the rest of the surroundings, then they pass over, as it were, into God's possession, and with that also into the domain of the painter. For God and the artist have the same riches and the same poverty accordingly. Now, in the nature that lay stretched about this communal farmland, God surely did not think to possess any particular treasure. It did not take long, however, for the artists to teach him better. The country round was flat, that there was no denying, but through the depth of its shadows and the brilliance of its lights, valleys and peaks were created, between which a countless number of intermediate tones corresponded to those areas of wide meadows and fertile fields that constitute the material wealth of a mountainous region. There were but few trees, and almost all of the same species, botanically speaking. Through the emotions they expressed, however, through the longings of some spreading branch or the gentle reverence of some trunk, they seemed like a great number of individual beings, and many a willow proved to be a personality which, through the complexity and depth of its character, provided the artists with one surprise after another. So great was their enthusiasm, they felt so much at one in this work of theirs. It was of no moment that after 6 months, each of the three had moved into a house of his own. That was surely just for reasons of space. But there is something else that must be mentioned here. The painters wanted to celebrate in some way the first anniversary of their society, out of which so much good had come in so short a time. And to this end, each determined secretly to paint pictures of the houses of the other two. On the appointed day, they came together, each with his pictures. It just so happened that they began to talk about their houses, how they were situated, how conveniently built, and the like. They became quite excited, and it turned out that in the course of the discussion, each of them forgot the oil sketches he had brought along, so that each arrived home late at night with his unopened parcel. How this could have happened is hard to understand, nor did they, during the next few weeks, show each other their pictures. And when one went to visit another, which, as a consequence of much work happening more and more seldom, he found on his friend's easel sketches from the very first period when they were still living together at the same farm. One day, however, the one on the right, he was living on the right too now, so I shall continue to call him thus, came into the studio of the one I have called the youngest, upon one of these unconfessed anniversary pictures aforementioned. He observed it thoughtfully for a time, then took it to the light, and suddenly burst out laughing. Fancy, I never knew, and it's not a bad conception of my house you've given here, a truly clever caricature. With these exaggerations in form and color, with that bold interpretation of my gable, which certainly is rather emphasized, really there's something in it. The expression of the face of the youngest took on was not one of his most becoming. On the contrary, in his consternation, he went to see the middle one, the most sensible of the three, hoping to be reassured by him. For when this sort of thing happened to him, he at once became despondent and inclined to doubt his own ability. His friend not being in when he arrived, he began poking around a little in the studio when his eyes promptly fell upon a picture that peculiarly repelled him. It was a house, but a perfect fool must have lived in it. What a facade! It could only have been built by someone who had no idea of architecture and had applied his miserable painter's notion to a building. Suddenly the youngest shoved the picture away as though it had burnt his fingers. In its left-hand corner, he had seen the date of that first anniversary, and next to it, the house of our youngest. Naturally, he did not wait for his host's return, but went home somewhat out of humor. After this, he and his fellow on the right had become careful. They sought subjects far afield, and of course did not dream of preparing anything against the second anniversary of their so promotive society. Their unsuspecting comrade in the middle worked all the more zealously at a subject that lay close to the house of the one on the right. Some vague sense kept him from choosing the house itself as the excuse for his picture. When he brought him the finished product, the friend on the right seemed remarkably reticent, just glanced at it fleetingly and made some casual comment. Then after a while he said, "I did not know you had been so far away lately." "How so, been away? Far?" The middle one didn't understand in the least. "Well, that's a good bit of work there," replied the other, evidently some Dutch motive or another. His sensible comrade in the middle laughed heartily. "Excellent," he exclaimed. "The Dutch motive lies before your very door." And he was not to be silenced. But his brother member did not laugh, not at all. He managed a wry smile and said, "A good joke." "But not at all," said the other. "Just open the door and I'll show you." And he started in that direction himself. "Stop!" ordered the master of the house. "I hereby declare to you that I have never seen that landscape and never shall see it, because to my eyes it is incapable of existing at all." But the other expostulated, surprised. "You insist?" shouted the painter of the right in his irritation. "Well, then I leave, and today. You force me to go, for I do not wish to live in such surroundings. Understand?" That was the end of their friendship, but not of the society. For to this day it has not been statutorily dissolved. Nobody had thought of doing that, and it may with good reason be said of this society that it had spread over the whole world. "It shows once more," interrupted the obliging young man, who had been thoughtfully screwing up his lips, "one of those marvelous results of cooperation. Surely many an outstanding master has been produced by this intimate association." "Allow me," I begged, as without warning he dusted off my sleeve. "This was really but the introduction to my story, though it is more involved than the story itself." "Well, I said that the society had spread all over the world, and that is a fact. Its three members fled from each other in true horror. Nowhere could they find peace. Each lived in constant fear that one or the others might notice a piece of his country and profane it by his malicious presentation. And when they had arrived at three opposite points on the earth periphery, the discomforting idea dawned upon each of them that his sky, the sky he had laboriously made his own through his growing originality, was still within reach of the others. In this shattering moment, they began, all three at once, to go backwards with their easels, and 5 steps more, and they would have fallen off the edge of the earth into infinity, and would now be performing with frenzied speed the double revolution round the earth and round the sun. But God's sympathy and attentiveness averted this inhumane fate. God saw their danger, and at that last moment, what else should he have done? He stepped out into the middle of the sky. The 3 painters startled in astonishment. They fixed their easels and set up their palettes. They could not let this opportunity slip. God does not appear every day, nor yet to everybody. And of course, each of the 3 thought God was standing to him alone. For the rest, they grew more and more engrossed in their interesting work. And every time God wants to go back into the sky again, St. Luke begs him to stay out a little while longer until the 3 painters have finished their pictures. And doubtless the 3 gentlemen have already exhibited these pictures, perhaps even sold them, asked the musician in the gentlest of tones. What are you thinking of? I parried. They are still painting away at God, and they will probably go on painting him till they die themselves. And should they meet again in life, which I consider out of the question, and show each other the pictures they have meanwhile painted of God, who knows, perhaps those pictures would be scarcely distinguishable ones from the other. And now we have reached the station. I still had 5 minutes. I thanked the young man for accompanying me and wished him the best of success for the young society which he so well represented. With his right forefinger, he flicked away the dust that seemed to weigh upon the windowsills of our little waiting room, and he was wrapped in thought. I must confess that I was already flattering myself that my little story had put him into this reflective mood. When, as a parting gesture, he drew a red thread out of my glove, I counseled him in gratitude. You know, you can go back across the fields. It's considerably shorter than the way by the road. Pardon me, the obliging young man bowed. I think I shall take the road again. I am trying to remember where it was. While you were being so good as to tell me some really important things, I thought I noticed a scarecrow in a field wearing an old coat, and one of the sleeves, seems to me it was the left, had caught on a stake so that it couldn't flap at all. Now I feel certain duty to render my little tribute to the common interests of humanity, which I look upon as a kind of society too, in which everyone has something he should do, by restoring to that left sleeve its proper purpose, namely, to flap in the wind. The young man walked away with the most engaging smile, and I nearly missed my train. Fragments of this story were sung by the young man at one of the club's evenings. God knows who contrived to set them to music for him. Herr Baum, the flag father, brought them home to his children, and the children have remembered some of the tunes. Interesting, because I myself am a painter, and hardly an artist, but some people say so. So I found this rather amusing. Mostly, I just finished a large portrait of a young woman called, her name is Summer. But I would find it difficult to be under scrutiny. I paint what I like, but obviously these people only painted what they thought was going to make them more famous. I don't know. And the last story in our book is called The Beggar and the Proud Young Lady. It happened that we, the schoolmaster and I, were witnesses to the following little incident. We have an old beggar who sometimes stands at the edge of the wood. Today, too, he was there, again, poorer, more miserable than ever, almost indistinguishable, though a sort of sympathetic mimicry, from the boards of the rotten wood fence against which he leaned. But then it happened that a very little girl came running up to him to give him a small coin. That in itself was not extraordinary, only the way she did it was surprising. She made her very best curtsy, tendered her little gift to the old man hurriedly, as though no one should see, curtsied again, and was gone. But those 2 curtsies were worthy of at least an emperor. This annoyed our schoolmaster quite particularly. He started toward the beggar, probably to drive him from his fence post, for, as we know, he was a director of the local charities and committed to the prevention of street begging. I held him back. But he protested, we are helping those people. I may even go so far as to say we support them. And now, if they beg on the streets too, it's sheer impertinence. Dear Mr. Schoolmaster, I attempted to calm him, but he continued to drag me along toward the wood. Dear Mr. Schoolmaster, I besought him, I must tell you a story. So urgently? He asked venomously. I took him up in all seriousness. Yes, right away, before you forget what we chanced to observe just now. The schoolmaster mistrusted me after my last story. I read that in his face and added in a conciliatory tone. Not about God, really not. God is not even mentioned in this story. It is something historical. With that, I had won. Just to say the word history, and every schoolmaster will prick up his ears, for history is something thoroughly respectable, has nothing capricious about it, and is often pendologically useful. I noticed that the schoolmaster was polishing his glasses again, a sign that his powers of vision had shifted to his ears, and I made adroit use of this propitious moment. I began. It was in Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici, young and not yet in power, had just composed his poem Trifolo di Baccio Ariana, and already it was echoing throughout all of the gardens. Those were the days of living songs. Out of the darkness of the poet's soul, they arose in men's voices and were wafted upon them, as on silver skiffs, fearless into the unknown. The poet began a song, and all who sang it brought it to its completion. In the Trionfo, as in most songs of that time, life is celebrated. That violin is the violin with serene singing strings and the dark background which is the stirring of our blood. Stanzas of uneven length mount upwards in a tumbling gaiety, but each time, just at the point of breathlessness, a short, simple refrain sets in that bends down from the dizzying height and, fearing the abyss, seems to close its eyes. It runs. How lovely is youth that delights us. yet who would hold it? Youth flees and regrets, and if one would be merry, let him be so today. Of tomorrow there is no certainty. It is to be wondered at that the men who sang such lines were overtaken by a haste, a striving to pile up all festivity tower-like, and on this today, upon the only rock on which it is worthwhile to build. Thus, too, can one explain the press of figures in the pictures of the Florentine painters, who sought to unite all their princes and their ladies and their friends in a single canvas. For painting was slow work, and who could know whether, when it came time for the next picture, all these people would still be so young and gay and friendly? This spirit of impatience naturally found its clearest expression in the young men. The most brilliant of these were sitting together after a banquet on the terrace of the Palazzo Strozzi, discussing the performances shortly to take place before the church of Santa Croce. In a loggia a little apart from the rest stood Palla degli Abbaziri with his friend Tommaso, the painter. They seemed to be arguing with increasing excitement till Tommaso cried, "That you will never do, I wager you never will." The others now took notice. "What's the matter?" inquired Gaetano Strozzi, strolling up with some of his friends. Tommaso explained. Palla says that at the festival he is going to kneel down before Beatrice Altuceri, that proud girl, and beg her to permit him to kiss the dusty hem of her robe. They all laughed, and Leonardo of the house of Rigardi said, "Palla will think twice about that. He well knows that the fairest women have a smile for him, which at other times one never sees upon their faces." Another added, "And Beatrice is still so young. Her lips are still too childishly firm to smile. That is why she seems so proud." "No," retorted Palla degli Abbaziri with excessive vehemence. "She is proud, but that is not the fault of her youth. She is proud as marble is in the hands of Michelangelo, proud as a flower in a picture of the Madonna, proud as a ray of sunlight passing over diamonds." Gaetano Strozzi interrupted him with some severity. "And you, Palla, are you not proud also? To hear you, one would think that you wanted to take your place among the beggars who would wait about the hour of Vespers in the courtyard of Santissima Annunziata till Beatrice Altuceri passes and with averted face gives each of them a soldo. "I will do even that," cried Palla with blazing eyes, and pushing his friends aside, he sprang down the staircase and disappeared. Tommaso was about to follow, but Strozzi held him back. "Let it be. He must be left to himself now. Then he will come to his senses sooner." And the young men dispersed into the garden. In the forecourt of Santissima Annunziata that evening, too, some 20 beggars, men and women, waited for Vespers. Beatrice, who knew them all by name and would sometimes visit the children and the sick in their wretched homes at the Porta San Nicolo, used to present each one of them in passing with a small silver coin. Today she seemed to be a little late. The bells had already rung their call, and only threads of their sound still hung about the towers above the darkening air. An uneasiness spread among the mendicants, also because a new beggar, a stranger, had slunk into the shadow of the porch, and they were about to drive him off in their jealousy when a young girl in a black, almost nunnish dress appeared in the forecourt, and, hampered in her progress by her pitying kindness went from one to the other, while one of her waiting women held open the purse from which she took her little gifts. The beggars fell on their knees, sobbed, and sought to lay their shriveled fingers for 1 second on the train of their benefactress's simple gown, or kissed its bottom hem with their wet, stammering lips. She had passed them all, and not one of the figures so well known to her was missing. But suddenly she became aware, under the shadow of the porch, of another figure in rags, a stranger. She was startled. She became confused. She had known all her poor friends as a child, and to help them had become as natural to her as, say, the dipping of one's fingers in the marble font of holy water that stands at the entrance of every church. It had never occurred to her that there might be beggars one did not know. How should one have the right to give these something too, since one had not earned the confidence of their poverty by someone knowing of it? Would it not have been an unheard of presumption to offer a stranger alms? And filled with the conflict of these dark emotions, the girl passed the new beggar by as though she had not noticed him, and stepped quickly into the cool, high church. But inside, as the service began, she could not remember a single prayer. A fear seized her that after Vespers she might no longer find the poor man in the porch, and she had done nothing to alleviate his need, while the night was so near, in which all poverty is sadder and more helpless than by day. Signing to the one among her waiting women who carried her purse, she slipped out with her into the porch. It had meantime become deserted, but the stranger still stood there, leaning against a pillar, and seemed to listen to the singing that came from the church, strangely remote, as if from heavens. His face was almost entirely hidden, as is sometimes the case with those lepers who do not uncover their hideous sores until one stands close before them, and they are sure that pity and loathing will speak equally in their favor. Beatrice hesitated. She was carrying the little purse herself, and felt that it contained only a few small coins. But with a sudden resolve she went up to the beggar and said, in an uncertain, slightly sing-song voice, and without lifting her fugitive gaze from her own hands, "I would not offend you, sir. I think, if I recognize you all right, I am in your debt. Your father, I believe, made the fine balustrade in our house of wrought iron, that adorns the staircase. Later, they found in the room where he sometimes used to work a purse. I think he must have lost it, surely." But the helpless lie upon her lips forced the girl to her knees before the stranger. She pressed the brocade purse into his hands, hidden in his cloak, and stammered, "Forgive me." For an instant Beatrice felt the beggar tremble. Then she fled back into the church with her frightened, waiting woman. Through the briefly opened door there burst a short, jubilant peal of voices. That is the end of the story. Messer Palla degli Abbaziri remained in his rags. He gave away all he had and went forth barefoot and destitute into the land. Later it is said to have lived near Subiaco. "Oh, those times," said the schoolmaster. "What's the good of it all?" He was on his way of becoming a prolificant, and through this incident he turned into a vagabond and eccentric. I am sure that nobody remembers him today. "Oh, but they do," I ventured to contradict. "His name is mentioned now and then in the great litanies of the Catholic Church, among those intercessors to whom they pray. for he became a saint. The children have heard this story too, and they declare, to the annoyance of their schoolmaster, that God does come into it. I am rather surprised at that myself, for I had promised the good schoolmaster to tell him a story without God in it. But of course, the children must know. So this completes, actually I didn't finish the last story. Now you'll have to get the book and read the last one. This concludes our enjoyment. I have been so honored to have done these readings for these many, many weeks. I've loved being with all of you. Please take care of yourself, be happy and holy, and become a saint yourself, please. Good night.